Evaluators created the logic model. No one else. Evaluators did. Why? Because they wanted it to evaluate. They wanted to help innovators like you to create a description of what the intervention was. And at that time, they were mostly programmatic interventions like we're talking about today. So the logic model, the value is it's supposed to be logical. We have some resources that we put into something. It generates, allows us to do some activities. These create some kind of products or outputs, right? Number of people coming to a barbecue, number of hamburgers, delivered, whatever those are. And that these outputs actually would trigger some kind of outcome. So generally it's benefits for participants, but it might be benefits for community. That was the immediate outcome. And then they made a distinction between long-term impact, saying sometimes the outcomes are just a means to an end to a bigger impact. Now, hey, the elegant simplicity of this is pretty nice. And it actually says if you're talking about results, there's really output results, outcome results, and impact results. Now, the world complexifies quite a bit, right? After this, because you have interventions that got lots of boxes. But the idea was to do that. Now, just to show of hands again, who has either been involved in or led a process to crank out a very basic logic model or a results chain? Just to show of hands. Okay, who's seeing it for the first time? Okay, so if you are seeing it like Naomi and others for the first time, I can only see some of you, there is endless resources on this. And so we'll have that in the worksheet. Like there's so many places to go to for assistance that this is probably the most well-developed tool in the evaluation toolbox ever. So don't, it's easy to catch up. Now, who's ever heard of a theory of change? Yeah, so how does a logic model differ from a theory of change? Anyone want to take a crack at that? Just change the voice here. No, okay. I can't see there we go, now I can see everybody. Okay, so let's pretend we do a logic model for cleaning up a schoolyard, right? The schoolyard in front of my house is dirty. So what we want to do is we have a pretty good hunch that the reason the schoolyard's dirty is because the garbage, there's not enough garbage cans. So there's rubbish all over the place. So what would the input be? Would be a garbage can, right? What would the activities be? People cleaning up garbage, putting it in the can. The output would be filled garbage cans, right? The outcomes would be cleaner yard and garbage cans taken away, and well, impact might be a sense of pride in the community, something like that. So that's a logic model. You know what a theory of change says? The theory says you have to be clear about why you think this is going to lead to that, right? What's the theory behind that? And so the hunch is, already we can use a theory of change says, well, already the hunch is the yard is dirty because there's not enough garbage cans. Maybe there's another hunch. Maybe it's because we live right next to the dump in a windy city. So you could put 500 garbage cans in the schoolyard, but you're not going to stop the wind from blowing the rubbish from the dump. That would make sense, right? And it assumes that the city will pick up the garbage can every 10 days, right? Or there's enough that it doesn't overflow. So the theory, and it assumes that the major impact of your urge for community pride is linked to the idea that people don't have pride because they have a dirty schoolyard. So what it says is saying, see all the little the arrows? What are the assumptions or what are the evidence behind the arrows? That's what a theory of change asks you to do. That's the real only difference. A logic model is a primitive executive summary of this will lead to this. A theory of change says you better tell us why. What's your rationale? And you can test that. So here's what I like about a theory of change. If you're even trying to do strategy, you don't even have to, you could assess a theory of change right up front because you're testing someone's assumptions. Mark, thanks for the garbage cans, but we live next to a dump. You don't have to implement anything. You could already start talking strategy, right? So here's the other thing that a theory of change does a little different. A theory of change is more likely to be able to handle more moving parts in your program activity. So this one is dead simple, right? Like boom, 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 garbage cans, clean, like that's simple. That's linear, one way. Sometimes things get really, really crazy and there's lots of moving parts and you actually saying, well, I've got multiple levels of outcomes. And some of these outcomes right over here, require an intervention. Some of them are going to happen on their own, right? Because it's kind of like a thinking tool, everyone. Now, not only is it a strategic thinking tool to help you start saying, well, this will lead to that, and this should lead to this, and will that happen on its own, or do we have to do something? Like, will the city, here's an example, the garbage cans will automatically get cleaned out by the city. And someone says, you know what, that doesn't happen. They don't come often enough. Can you see my arrows, guys? You can't, no, let me just see, oops. So you see the right here, here? It might be, you know what? Damn it, Emily, we got to get a committee together to tell the city to stop cleaning them up every month, but they got to come every 10 days. We have to intervene in order for that to happen. And what would the indicators be? So I'm just going to stop there for a second, just to see if this is making sense. So logic model, visual executive summary, nice and primitive, easy to do. Theory of change says, tell me why you think that's going to happen. And if you have a lot of moving parts, tell me where we have to intervene in order to make something happen. How does this look? Christine, we've talked about this. Any reflections on these distinctions for community building work? Because we're going to get into some archetypes right away.
Well, I think we should just open it up and see what questions. I know several people on the call have used both of these. So what questions are you coming to the call today around development of logic models or theories of change?
Yeah. Again, this is a rehearsal for some, a reminder, and others have done some. Okay, well, we'll come back. We'll check in on this. So this, hold on to this, because what we're saying is that might be a universal way of trying to conceptualize a programmatic intervention. There's stuff that gets even deeper. In fact, Christine, I'm going to ask you just to speak to these two as examples of logic models. So this one's from Edmonton. Christine, tell us, remind us.
I just did a search online to see what theories of change and logic models I could find to try to give some just different variations in how you could illustrate this. So this one, sort of shows the levels of indicators that are used, the levels of outputs and activities and inputs, both vertically and horizontally. So this is one that I think shows really clearly what the goals are, the top two goals of healthy city and having urban places that are vibrantly connected. Debris, I don't know if you're familiar with this and if you have anything you'd like to add to this example.
No, this is exactly what the city does for their logic models when they do revitalization in each neighborhood. And these are the two new strategic goals that relate to the work in this area. The city has 4 strategic goals, but these are the only 2 that relate: healthy city and urban places.
And Deborah, because it's the city and they've got so many tools and so many partners, this is understandably got a lot of moving pieces.
You bet.
Right? There's lots of elements to this. And this doesn't mean, by the way, Deborah, if I'm wrong, that the city has to do all these. This is like a framework to understand what everyone is doing. It's kind of like, are we aligned? In what areas are we aligned, and who's doing what in each of these bubbles and arrows?
Yeah, it's definitely a collective impact. What I would say, the downtown business, the business association, the citizens, the city, and any other institutions and organizations in that area.
Yeah. So now that who's seen something as busy as this one as a logic model? Yeah. If you scan, I think like you did, Christine, you probably saw lots of these. If you Google logic models, theories of change, they're endless. They're out there. Everyone's got one, and they're good. They're a good thinking tool, right? They if they're not too linear sometimes, and sometimes you get logic models on steroids, kind of like this one. Like it could even get more crazy, but they're a good way to try and get on the same page. But again, from an evaluation point of view, evaluation is always a little bit parasitic on the strategist being clear, right? That's why when evaluators, when strategists aren't entirely clear, evaluators kind of go, well, I don't know what to track. You can still track stuff. You could simply say what happened. But this tells you, start paying attention to these kinds of outcomes with these players, and then you can begin to get a bit more clear. So we got another one here.
If you just go back, I like how they use the sense of community index and the social vulnerability index, and they've clearly listed which indicators they're using. The number of neighbors who are known by name, the number of times individuals are present and associated in public, number of initiatives. So they've clearly listed at the bottom there at those indexes which of the indicators they're using. So it's a really nice, clear plan on a page.
Yeah.
But I do think it often doesn't show the actual impact.
Deborah, are you talking about impact on safety?
Yeah, I feel like if you pick the impact of a few of these things, it'll show a lot of numbers, but maybe not necessarily the narrative or the impact.
Right. Yeah, remember, it's one of our principles: no narratives without numbers, no numbers without narratives. Yeah, but I think, to your point, Christine, it's an organizing framework that makes explicit what is often implicit in our work. So it's good to map it for communicating. Oh, that's what you're doing. It's good to say, are we on the same page or not for strategy, design, right? Oh, I don't like that bubble, or I'm in that bubble, not that bubble. And again, from an evaluation point of view, it begins to say, oh, okay, now we have a rough sense of what it is, what are the outcomes and impacts, and maybe disagree. And we can start wrestling with, well, how the hell are we going to track that? Maybe quantitative indicators, as we know, don't always do it. You took a more narrow one in the next one, found a good one. I like this one because I'm working on some mentoring program and I didn't know this one existed. So Christine, why did this one seem significant to you?
Well, I liked that they started with the needs, which, logic models don't always do. So just sort of framing the reasons why they have this mentorship program in place. So, lack of pride, lack of positive role models, racism, low self-esteem. And then they've clearly divided up the inputs into different categories, the activities into different categories, and then the outcomes and impact between initial, medium, and long term. So I just think it's really clear. I get a sense of what goes into this program in one glance.
Yeah. And it does show, again, the diversity of ways of doing logic models or results chains. There's so many of them. Christine and Deborah and others, my summary is logic models are good for simple linear interventions. Theories of change are better when it gets more complex and there's a lot more moving parts, right? And you have to be more clear about why this will lead to that. So it's just a general way of thinking about it. One more, we're going to do two more, Christine. Maybe we'll go quicker with these ones. This one is cool. It doesn't look like the ones we just saw.
Yeah, so this one, you'll get to see the entire booklet. It comes from East Scarborough Storefront as part of their connected community approach. And I just took one snapshot from this whole booklet. Actually, it's a whole booklet on their theory of change. And they tell the story of all the different components of their connected community initiative and how they built it. But this one page sort of summarizes all of that to say, this is how they believe change will happen. If they broker relationships between people, they create platforms for organizing, they build capacity, then it will result in learning and access to programs and services, economic opportunities, civic participation. So it's very clear, we do this, we get that.
Yeah. Christine, what's remark that sometimes theories of change are like process theories, right? They say, if we broker relationships and engage, these are the kinds of actions that will emerge. And you're kind of agnostic about the content of the outcomes, but this seems like there's a process theory here. If we engage these processes, these substantive things will happen. Yeah. That's good. It'd be great to see. Is there a link to this one? You said?
There is. As part of the homework for this module, we are going to be sending a link to a whole folder full of impact reports, and the whole theory of change, which is a whole report for this group, is included in that folder. So they'll get the whole booklet.
Great. Okay, we're going to do one more, and then we're going to just show some archetypes here. Here's one more theory of change. This one has got some pretty nice pictures. Christine, the fourth and final one, what drew you to this one?
It's just very different. It's really focused more on, the high level. If we do this, then this is how it'll have an impact on youth. They identify sort of the key components of what they'll do, identifying sparks, adopting a growth mindset. They define what thriving means. So I really like that they sort of define their own notion of what a thriving youth population would look like. And it's just really engaging. I love looking at this. I'm drawn in as a reader, and I want to read about their initiative.
Yeah. Anyone like this one as well? It is pretty compelling. Well, you know what all of these 4 things did, including the 2 just rough diagrams we showed before? It reminds us of this. As change makers, we have to tell the reader what an outcome is. We have to frame it. We could frame it this way. We could frame it this way. We could frame it these ways. Numbers without a narrative context like this don't mean anything. They're just numbers. We're going to end up showing them infographics without context. 30 of these and 42 of these and 50 of these. So all of them are clumsy. None of them are perfect, but you got to like the one, but we have to frame it to communicate, to design, and to evaluate. So these are just different expressions of that. And I'm glad we ended off on such a nice, kind of an outlier one, because this only could come after people got really geeky with these things. These are geeky ones, guys. I mean, I kind of like them because I'm a geek, but they're not as remotely as fun and engaging as we go through this. So folks, you feeling this now? Different ways to conceptualize logic models, theories of change. We have to describe it in order to get moving forward. We're going to now just quickly, I guess I'm going to do that because I'm the host. Put people in small groups here right away, but we think there's at least 3 kinds of programmatic interventions. Now, there's probably more, but when it comes to our work, we think there's 3 kinds, and you might add. A deepened community initiative. This is something you might do where the primary purpose is to build connections and relationships. Right? Ever done one of those? Doesn't even matter what it is. You might actually generate some outcomes that are the well-being outcomes, like we cleaned up the park. That's nice, but it was primarily to get people talking to each other and doing stuff, right? Number 2, you might have an initiative that is a traditional program or service that aims to improve a well-being outcome, but in a way where one of the spin-offs is, hey, we got some connections going on too, and some relationships building. It's a spin-off. That would make sense? The first one, it's connections, relationships, primary. A splattering of well-being outcomes is nice. This one is, no, well-being right up front. And we also get some connections one. And the third one is kind of like this as well. This is grassroots organizing. It's not a traditional program and services developed by Big Brothers, Big Sisters, etc., or the city, etc. It is grassroots organizing. By the way, Deborah, I think abundant communities is a deepening community thing. It's primarily designed to build connections, relationship. There's a million little spin-offs, men's sheds, etc., but that's not the primary purpose. It's nice if men create a tool shed and show kids how to fix bikes and stuff. The final one is grassroots organizing. I went back to my case study, stopping drug deals in the park. Wasn't such an enormous thing, but we sure got to know our neighbors by saying, hey, let's just make sure they're not selling drugs in front of kids. Right. So there's some spin-offs there. Does this one make sense? So we think there's archetypes, and the reason we wanted to do that is if we're trying to tell a story, we've got these little examples. So a Hey Neighbor initiative, that's primary purpose is to deepen communities. You can see that we would ask, what does it take to develop this program? Deborah, if you were doing it for abundant communities, you could be really clear about the inputs, the activities, the outputs, how many people are involved and how. And then it gets into the primary outcome is how many participants develop relationships and connections in the short term and in the long term. And then you have these spin-offs. So Deborah, can you give me a quick example of when abundant communities connects people, what are the kinds of activities that they might take above and beyond the connection? I don't know if the tool shed is a good example, the men's shed. No, it's called the men's shed.
It is, and I think they'd probably call that their own spin-off.
Right.
What we've probably seen is people have done safety groups in their neighborhood. So it's not neighborhood watch, but they've done their own safety walking groups in neighborhoods.
Yep.
All kinds of different groups is probably what we would say were the spin-offs that you found.
There you go. That's right. And they're all dealing with some substantive issue of well-being, safety, or.
That's right.
You know,
So kind of the 7 responsibilities of the neighborhood talked about it in Abundant Community. It could be
Right
a
on.
community garden or yard sharing. Their neighborhood is doing that.
Right on. Perfect. Well, you've even framed the types of spinoffs that would emerge.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, that's a bit different than this one. So how have participants, what are the outcomes of a mentoring program? The mentoring program, oddly enough, is meant to build relationships as well, right? But it's often designed to say, help this kid with, let's see if we can improve school outcomes, right? There's so many, when programs are funded in mentoring now, they're often buying an outcome, improved school achievement, or preventing kids from, hanging out with some bad peers, et cetera, right? That's how the program service works. But my goodness, is it not rich with outcome build, connection and relationship building? So that would be an example of that. And the third one that we thought, this grassroots organizing, and again, I've already mentioned it, you're just spontaneously getting together to deal with the quality of life issue. It's not a traditional program. It's possibly episodic. It happens once in a while. Clean up the schoolyard, stop a drug deal, paint a fence, etc. You're organizing, or stop a landlord. I've just been with some Americans, and who saw Alinsky Community Organizing, and they just went to a landlord where and found out where this person went to church, happened to be a church, and on Sunday they all stood outside the church and said, clean up your apartments, as this person walked out with his family. So that's an organizing outcome, very American. Canadians just probably would start crying. We couldn't handle the conflict. But that's a good example. So I'm going to throw it over to Christina, and maybe if I'm the boss, I can put people into small groups. Maybe we just do this one together, because I don't think I prepped the small group stuff, Christine. Let's just play with these questions. Do your programs fall into one or more of these archetypes? And are you using, if so, a model or theory of change to illustrate the kinds of outcomes that might come spinning out of that? So let's throw that open. Anyone? I'm going to actually just pick people. Laverne, because you're the first on here on my screen, do your stuff fall into these archetypes? Are there archetypes that we haven't considered yet?
Sorry about that. So our age-friendly initiative, I think it's more about deepening community connections.
Yep.
We're hoping that through building awareness among ourselves about how seniors are doing in our communities, as well as other ages, then we'll, because we don't have a municipal staff that's going to follow up afterwards, we need the people themselves to organize themselves. And sometimes they're already in groups, and sometimes there's something that hall board can do. And hopefully then they'll take the initiative to do that. So it's about deepening community interventions, and then it could lead into some programs and services. Grassroots organizing, we want to take advantage of spontaneous things that arise in the community. So when we're just finishing the seniors phone survey, and when we hear what they say, then that's what we're going to base our next steps on. So it's a bit of grassroots way to look at it too, and that we're wanting those involved to make the decisions, right? To take it forward.
Yeah. So there's an overlap between 1 and 3. Yeah, terrific. Thank you. And are you using logic models or theory of change for any of them, just to describe them, or are you've managed to operate them without doing that to date?
Well, I'm looking at trying to make a plan that I can show to my advisory committee, and so I find it the straight across linear doesn't really describe it. So I'm going to have to come. I'm looking forward to that folder of pictorial ways to show it. I forget what the question was.
No, it's good. Are you using logic models or theory of change? You're saying theory of change is probably not all that helpful, but you're looking for other options.
No, they both have their places, right? Depends on what you're doing. And sometimes it's straightforward, linear. This is the action, this is the results. And other times we're still looking at what's underlying this, like what's deeper, how can we understand it in such a way that we could do something that will have better impacts.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Laverne. Why don't we just adjust the question a little bit? Is there anyone have anything that doesn't fall into these archetypes? Is there another way to think about the work you're doing on the ground that we haven't been able to capture in these three? I think we should take Laverne's point, Christine in particular, that some of these are overlapping. And they might kind of change over time, right? What starts off as grassroots turns into traditional programming, et cetera.
You know, Mark, I think what I would do if I did this and added a few things,
Yeah.
for the grassroots part, what I might put in is a few things that happened during COVID. So we saw neighborhoods like the city quit cutting grass. You know, let's just chuck something out there in parks. And they banded together, took their own lawnmowers and cut the grass.
Yeah.
So I think I would add a lot of those really interesting, fun things.
That's excellent. Yeah, that's a great example, Deborah. I'm sure other cities had something similar. Services go and some neighbors or neighborhoods take up the challenge to fill the gap. Excellent, Deborah. Karen, were you weighing in? I saw you unmute.
Yeah, this is interesting to me because I know that the goal of a strengthening neighborhood strategy, which we have, is to increase the relationships and sort of build capacity and have people lead and make decisions. And so most of what we do is they provide the inputs part of the logic model, because we have an equipment lending program, we have a booking process, we have all of these pieces that are like the inputs to allow neighbors to do the activities that then will in turn build community. So I was kind of looking at, okay, well, I think it's deepen community, but we are actually just supporting the grassroots piece.
If we were in front of a flip chart, Karen, I'd have this, I feel like drawing a picture where you'd say, we have a process strategy. We provide the inputs, and then I would show multiple different shoots and arrows coming out and saying, we don't know what's going to happen. It depends on them. And then give illustrations of the splash and ripple of things that we create the ingredients for the splash, but everyone's got their own splash and ripple.
Yeah, I like it.
That's an interest. That's for sure a process strategy. Do you actually, when you provide the equipment, how do you animate it? Like, do you tell people it's there and then you facilitate some kind of initial meeting, or is it how much more than the inputs? How do you animate the inputs?
We do all kinds of things depending on who's asking us. So if it's someone who's never done anything before, there may be some hand holding as far as how to, find the form on our website and fill it out and where to go to pick up the stuff. And we have some resources on what games they can play with some of the things they're borrowing. We have a movie night where all we really ask them to do is the networking and advertising, and then we kind of do the rest. So that one's a bit more of a program. But yeah, it just depends on the group. We'll attend a meeting or we'll just say, here's the stuff. It's the capacity really of the group.
See, it's awesome, because then you could also have on the sidebar principles, right? We have a principle of demand side use, like leadership. I'll screw up the framing of that principle, but the principle is people drive the process and we're there to help.
Yeah, and I think our experience is if they're not driving it, it just doesn't really happen.
Yeah. Awesome.
Can I add to that with Karen?
Sure.
I'm from London too. We didn't develop those toolkits and the process part on our own. We developed that with the community in our original Strengthening Neighborhood strategy. And that was one of the things they told us they needed. So there was already the will there for that. So we didn't have to build, we didn't just plop down and say, we think this is a good idea, go do this if you want it. It was built along the way.
I used to know a bit more about London's work about 8-9 years ago, but I feel like you have a community development orientation that spins off lots of different initiatives. This is just one dimension, but you have a platform and a culture that leads to these things.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, well, hey, already, Christine, be pretty cool to visualize everyone's theory of change a little bit using whatever modalities they're using. I really like the splash and ripple image, Karen, that you suggested. Let's do one more. Anything on here, variations on a theme, either a theory of change, logic model, or different archetypical programmatic interventions? Okay, well, hey, Christine, maybe I'm really interested in this toolkit, this folder now as well, of all the different manifestations. Let's move on to the next thing. And before we do, can you just give me a time check? I can't see my clock because I'm now the host.
It's
Probably.
10:40, so we have just under 20 minutes left.
Yeah.
I did have a question before we move on to the next topic on innovation, which was how do you integrate multiple theories of change together? So, for example, if you have an equity and inclusion program and strategy and theory of change, and then you have a neighborhood, which has equity inclusion certainly has spin-off benefits for community connection, and then you have a specific neighborhood one and maybe then a seniors one. How do you then take all of those theories of change and merge them? And I'm asking this question after speaking with London and hearing about all the different strategies they have there. To me, that's where it gets tricky, is how do you merge or illustrate those once you have more than one operating simultaneously? And London, feel free to jump in.
Yeah,
either
let's
of you
throw it out
have,
to the group. Let's ask this: how many people feel the urge? Oh, here's some poetry. The urge to merge, the urge to converge. All these different high-level frameworks. Like, who feels that pressure? Yeah, Laverne, Deborah, a little bit, Karen, Donna, Emily, not so much. Naomi, maybe not. You didn't put up your hand. You don't urge. Okay, that's really interesting, and that you often hear then city councils in particular talk about, oh, who's coordinating all of this? Even though, quite frankly, city councils are sometimes the ones stewarding the generation of multiple different initiatives, and at one point go, what the hell? Like, how do all these things get? Maybe just a quick summary. I do think there's different levels of theories of change. So sometimes you might say, here's a high-level theory of change and the general relationship between all these ideas. And then as you get more granular, it becomes a little bit easier to say or not how the senior strategy is overlapping with the abundant community initiative, right? You might just say there's a real dotted line or a strong line. So there's something about different levels of theories of change, 30,000, 3,000 feet, and 300 feet. I think that helps a bit. So it's not just one theory of change for them all. And number two, I've often seen people start really emphasizing principles as saying, we are interested in equity, and so here's 2 or 3 principles that we're inserting into our abundant community initiative. I'm never just leaning on abundant community as an example, or our mentoring program. And so you try and insert them as a general principle, but you don't overly design how they happen. How do we build relationships and connections in a way that increases equity? Right? You're just saying, well, we know it's part of our theory. We don't know actually that manifests itself differently across programs. So, but there is a challenge of trying to merge all these things and to make sense of them, knowing that sometimes they don't make sense, everybody. We have 1,000 flowers bloom. We're in a community where people are doing a bunch of stuff and there's friction and overlap, and it's just a vibrant community trying lots of stuff. And sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't.
Just a bit of an aside, I think what happens is that each of us and each of our institutions have our own theory of change.
It's true, yeah.
And to the degree we can bring those out and talk about them and describe them and picture them, then we have a better chance of while making our work more more
Coherent.
concrete, but also knowing that we're working with people who think differently than we do. So, you know,
Yeah.
I'd like to, figure out how to do that.
Well, Laverne, that's what you did. Maybe that's where we started. The great reason to do this is simply to say, here's the story in my head. You're looking at the activities, but you don't
Yeah.
know the story in my head, our strategy. So let's make the theory of change logic model tries to make that explicit.
Yeah.
It takes what is implicit, makes it explicit. It can help us take what is fragmented, like Carla, you got a spin on it, Donna, you got a spin on it, and we're all in the same room, right? And we can try and make it shared, right?
Yeah.
From implicit to explicit, from fragmented to shared. And I'll throw one more in there. Sometimes, I don't know about you, but I've sketched out my strategy and I look at it and I go, you know what, that's pretty wobbly. Like, I don't know if that's all that strong, this hunch. And so by the testing of it, you can make it robust, more robust.
Mhm.
So implicit to implicit, fragmented to shared, from wobbly to robust. So the very act of producing this together is developmental, and it helps with communication. It helps with strategy. And again, selfishly for our stuff, it helps us to say, now we framed it well enough that we can track an impact and let people know why it matters.
Yeah.
It matters, Karen, to me in your thing. So what would happen? I'd say, well, how many groups actually spontaneously use those resources that you're making available? Right? Why? Because I know that's an issue. Your theory of change says people will, in a demand side sort of way, start using those resources. So that's a pretty good metric. Hey, we had 37 different groups doing 22 different things. For Deborah, right? We've got 23 sheds and 14 communities doing self-organizing. I go, well, I know why those changes are meaningful now, because I understand the theory of it. This is awesome. Guys, just because of time, knowing that I think we're elaborating quite a bit here, I think we learned a couple things about multiple models, ways to express theories of change, the reason why to do it, that some of these archetypes spill over each other. They're not completely perfect. Let's go. I'm actually not going to share the parrot story that much, but one of the things to emerge out of the parrot story, remember, is those kids to the left-hand side creating a fundraiser to contribute to a bird sanctuary. Now, why does that matter? Again, if we zoom out and we're trying to save that jaquette bird, we have a context for understanding why that's meaningful. Kids, the awareness campaign triggered a bunch of kids to start creating a fundraiser for the bird. In this case, we thought it was archetype number 3. It's self-organizing. The primary purpose is to save the bird, right? To contribute to saving the bird. But there's clearly some community building, connection, relationship outcomes happening at the same time on the bottom right. So we could say that, hey, we raised $200 for a jaquette. I forgot how much they raised. But these kids sure have an identity with, they know each other better and they have a stronger identity to our community. That was the identity building campaign that was part of the larger strategy, right? Make people care about this bird. And so if you wanted to start tracking stuff, level 1, level 2, level 3, you could talk about the outputs, how many people come into the fundraisers, right? You could talk about outcomes. Here are the things that happen because of the outputs. And if you wanted to do impact, the hardest thing to do, you could go even deeper. So when you're telling stories, you're always making choices. How far along the results chain can I gather information? If, Emily, I think we had talked about this in one of the first groups, if you're all alone and you got a half a time of this and a half time volunteer, you may not be able to do level 2 and 3, right? But if you have a good narrative and a story, you could do level 1 and saying, well, we think level 2 and level 3 are going to happen, right? So as long as you have a big framing and a narrative, you don't have to be explosive with impact indicators and outcome indicators. It's nice if you can, but you can always get away with level 1 if you've got a good narrative. So that's just using the logic model there. And in the spirit of seeing how fast we could do it, we did decide not to create another module and just to do this in 3 slides. We're going to see if we can. What if, Laverne, the project you're working on is successful and you want to scale it? Deborah, Abundant Community has already scaled, so this is a journey you've already been on. Karen and Donna, the use of the tools and the materials campaign, you know, at one point it was small and then you want it to scale. How do we understand that process as an innovative process? Well, we're going to show you two frameworks here. Number one, returning to our imperative story, we want to emphasize the idea that innovation tends to happen along a continuum. People have a bright idea, then they often go into prototyping. How many people have mucked around with prototyping? You probably have, you just didn't call it that. You know what prototyping is? Sketching out a rough idea, saying it could look and feel like this. So Karen and Don, if you were doing that in the early design days, you might be saying, here's a circle and here's all the material. Then you have arrows coming. Here's what the groups would do, right? And then sticky notes. Well, what the hell would happen if we did this? You start giving a visual representation to an idea, and rapid prototypes say, and by the way, we're not prescribing that you should do this. We're just giving you an example of how some people do it. You might be saying, hey, take that sketch and go talk to the recreation department, right? And see what they think, right? Rapid prototypes, a rough visualization idea. What do you think would work? What do you think would not work, right? Do you think we should do this? Then people sometimes say, hey, that's pretty good. Why don't we actually go do a field prototype? Now, field prototype's different than a pilot. A field prototype is, let's just walk through pieces of it or all of it. We're not live yet, right? So can we get the benches up? And let's throw the benches up. And who would take care of cash? So you're actually experimenting in the field, but you're not live yet, because a pilot is live. It's like a pre-pilot. It's like a small bet before a big bet. A lot of you may not use this words. A lot of you do this all the time. This is work. Small bets before big bets. Then you may or may not do a pilot. Then you might adopt the initiative. In the case of the kids, they did the thing once and they adopted it. They go, hey, we're going to do it every year. I think that's what they said, or every 2 months. Now, what about scaling it? They'd say, this worked really well with their one classroom, and we want to do more than sustain it. We want to scale it. So then they go into the next dimension. Most things before we do this should not be scaled. Why? Most things might just be good enough, and they're not any less important because they're not scalable. But sometimes they're scalable. So the kids, in this case, they wanted to scale out. Scale out is expanding the number of people doing it. Starting with 20 students in one classroom, one school, now we're in 6 schools, 50 classrooms and 1,000 students. That's scaling out, right? That makes greater numbers. Scaling deep is capturing hearts and minds. People have to really give a crap about whatever you're dealing with, right? If you haven't captured hearts and minds, you're not likely going to get people to replicate, right? And hearts and minds are really important. So why do people like it? What do they not like about it? How do you capture their hearts and minds? Hey, I lived in KW, Kitchener-Waterloo, and I know that Kitchener-Waterloo was the home of the Blue Box, right? Across Canada, the Blue Box is now not such a big thing because of the evolution recycling. But when they did the Blue Box, they did it as a prototype, and then they went to 4 pilots. And the Blue Box, everyone remembers the Blue Box, right? The Blue Box was the most successful pilot. And then they not only adopted it in Waterloo, but then they had to scale it. So how do you, now everyone was into recycling, so capturing hearts and minds wasn't that hard about the general idea, but you had to get hearts and minds about the Blue Box program. You had to get greater numbers of communities working, and then you had to do the last thing. Sometimes you got to change the systems in which the innovation is embedded in order for the scaling to work. It's not just good enough to have 40 communities and everyone drinking the Kool-Aid. Policies have to change. Regulations have to change. You have to build new facilities, right? You have to build the ecosystem around the innovation. That needs to change. And that's why most innovations, when they try to scale them, don't work, because people just focus on scaling out. And scaling deep, they don't think about scaling up. I'm going to stop there just to see if this reveals anything to you. These two, it's just a simple framework. Christine and I made a real deliberate decision not to create another workshop. We just thought we could just animate this, and we're using that little program there. But number one is innovation sometimes simply stops at adoption. Like, you've got it and that's good enough. And you often go through these steps. Sometimes if it wants to go further, we have to scale, and we at least have to scale in 3 dimensions. And if you did, you would talk about these questions here. How many people are participating? Have we captured hearts and minds? How do we prove that? How have we shifted systems to enable the original innovation to survive? Let's just stop there and see if there's any reactions. Who finds this, we're gonna just show of hands. Who finds this helpful? And then we're gonna ask the other one saying, who finds this confusing? So first one, who finds it helpful to think about the experimentation continuum and the eventuality of scaling? Okay, number of people. Who might find it, I think I saw 2 hands, who finds it confusing? Oh,
I have a question. So a lot of the work that we do is, I think our goal, lofty goal, is that we don't have to do the work anymore because all the neighborhoods are strong, they're connected, they have good leaders, they create their own parties. They don't need us to do stuff anymore. They've figured out how to do it. So it looks like we're not doing the work anymore once we've scaled up and out and they're sort of off our grid. That's good.
It is good.
But when we're measuring outputs and outcomes and those kinds of things, it's really hard to show. It might look from one year to the next that we're not doing as good a job because we're not connecting with as many community associations, for instance.
Right. That's where I love that example, Donna, because that's where your theory of change comes in. Saying success at this level is we don't have to intervene that much, right? So we would say, hey, the lack of our needing to intervene and the continued block parties is pretty good. And you might inadvertently say, boy, the fact that all of a sudden we have to rebuild some of these groups, not rebuild, but engage again.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say it's a negative thing because I'm going to give you my bias about social change. We always say we're working ourselves out of business, right? If everyone, a lot of you use that. What about health? You're always going to need a hospital. You can still do a good job, but you're still going to need hospitals. Why is community development ever going to go? Community development's like a hospital to me. It's another social piece of infrastructure. We always need community development. And sometimes we're doing really good and sometimes it's weak. And then a pandemic comes and we're really on call and we got to mow lawns and take care of each other. So I have a theory of change of my own around the nature of that. But to your point, that's what a theory of change allows us to do. We have to frame what good is. We succeed when people spin off on their own and they continue to have a self-refueling. I like that word, self-refueling. They keep refueling themselves. We don't have to keep putting input and input. It's self-refueling. That's an outcome. And so we track to what degree we have to intervene again.
I almost feel like it's when there's a stress on a community, that's when they come together. So they come together to rally around. They don't like a development or something. They come together to do something. And now COVID, we've noticed a lot of the neighborhood associations have really grown and there's much more connection and they're much better connected with each other and turning to us for some support. But again, it means we don't have to try and force that.
Yeah. And one argues that you're doing field building. You're creating infrastructure that, part of, I live in Edmonton. I think Edmonton, and so I know KW quite well, and I knew London a bit. I think I know Nelson a little bit too. Edmonton is stronger because it thinks a lot about community building. It always has since the 1920 with the community leagues. So there's moments in time. I went to a soccer game once when I just came back to Edmonton, 2002, 2003. It was Women's Under-19 World Cup. Remember anyone soccer player here? The current, so that was with all those women were young kids, right? This was big, and it was the final game against the Americans, and it was under-19 women's soccer. Commonwealth Stadium had 52,000 people in it. 52,000, why? Community leagues and soccer leagues. Community leagues, everyone got good deals and you could get a community, say 120 kids or 150, it was that infrastructure. So you build that infrastructure and it's nice to have it in a soccer game. It's really nice to have it in a pandemic. So we build infrastructure not knowing that it can help in times like this, emergencies. So I think that's the rationale for talking about connections and relationships. Sometimes it's to stop a drug deal. Sometimes it's to mow the lawn. Sometimes it's in a pandemic, neighbors know that they better go check on their neighbor. Hey, Christine, we have time for one or two more comments on this. This, guys, folks, is just an interpretive framework. We're trying to make explicit again the dynamics of innovation and scaling. It's not detailed, but it says things go on a journey, small bets before big bets. Many things stop at 5, which is fine, but if you go to 6, you at least have to pay attention to these things. And they each have their own numbers and stories.
We're actually just at time. I just want to let people hop off if they have another meeting, but maybe we can take this to our December 10th Q&A session and continue on this conversation, because I think there's a lot here for us to unpack.
And aren't some of these pieces, this could be some of our communication, obviously, whether it's step A, step B. Okay, yeah.
Well, actually, you know what? I would actually argue that when we're talking to councils, this thing is really helpful. This one, I've used this a bunch of times with councils, saying, hey, everyone, most things are not going to be scaled, but here's a couple that have scaled, right? And that's important. And they like that. Not everything should be scaled, but when it is scaled, it looks like this. And hey, by the way, council, you might have to change some regulations. This thing can't scale by itself. You got to change that policy or that reg, or let schools open on Fridays at 4. You can't just do it in a pilot. We have to make that a regular thing. Well, Christine, maybe you can just finish with the storyboard then.
Right. So we just wanted to return to the storyboard framework. You could put your innovation and sort of the journey of your innovation onto a storyboard framework to show how you went from that ideation and prototyping to piloting and scaling. You could also use the storyboard framework to show how you scaled something up or out or scaled something deep. So just think about those two concepts we discussed today and think how you might map that out step by step and visualize that in a communication piece, such as an impact report. So that's pretty much it for this week. We do have a folder, as I said, full of impact report examples that we will be sending out, and we would love you to take a look at those and kind of give your thoughts around what aspects of each of the reports you like or might adopt or tweak for your own reports. So we'll be going through those with Lisa at the session in November.
It's great. Hey, everyone. Thanks for holding on. We did 2 big ideas rather than breaking it up into another workshop. One more little piece of scaffolding laid, and we'll see each other at the next module.
Bye, everybody.
And again, Ontario, don't be selfish, send good weather our way. Send it west. Okay, see ya.
Thank you so much. That was great.